Hi, Steve Schwinn here. Welcome, and thanks for joining me. We've been hearing a lot from the White House these days about the president's authority to issue a nationwide isolation or stay-at-home order or a nationwide quarantine order, or to lift those orders and put the United States back to work. So all this asks the question, does the president actually have authority to do that? I thought we'd take a look at that question today. Let's start with some first principles. Under our Constitution, the president doesn't have a kind of roving authority to go out and do stuff. Our Constitution just doesn't work that way. Our Constitution says that the president has to have authority to take actions that the president takes. There are a couple of sources of authority that the president could have. So, for example, one source of authority is Congress. Yeah, that Congress. Congress can enact legislation that then authorizes the president to go out and enforce or execute the law. That's one source of authority. A second source of authority is the Constitution itself. Yeah, that Constitution. Article 2 of the Constitution gives the president some what we call inherent executive authority that belongs to the president and the president alone. This is authority that's hardwired into Article 2 of the Constitution so that Congress can't change it unless Congress has some sort of counterbalancing authority. A common example of this is the Commander-in-Chief authority. The Commander-in-Chief authority is specifically listed in Article 2. The president has it as an inherent Article 2 presidential authority. There's yet another source of authority that the president probably has, and that is emergency authority to defend the nation in a time of crisis. So, for example, if the nation is invaded, for example, the president probably has some powers that aren't listed in the Constitution and may not be specifically covered by statute. The president probably has some of these powers to go out and defend the country. So let's take these first principles and see if we can't apply them to the authority of the White House, to the president, to issue a nationwide isolation or stay-at-home order. In this case, Congress has delegated some authority to the Department of Health and Human Services to order isolation and quarantine under certain circumstances. So the delegation in this point comes from Congress, the power comes from Congress, but the president supervises the Department of Health and Human Services and the Centers for Disease Control and the Surgeon General, who are specifically delegated this authority under the Act. Let's take a look at the law itself and then the regulations that implement the Act. Let's take a look at the law. This is in Title 42, United States Code, Section 264. The Surgeon General, with the approval of the Secretary, is authorized to make and enforce such regulations as in his judgment are necessary to prevent the introduction, transmission, or spread of communicable diseases from foreign countries into the states or possessions, or from one state or possession into any other state or possession. Now let's take a look at the implementing regulation. Whenever the Director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention determines that the measures taken by health authorities of any state or possession, including political subdivisions thereof, are insufficient to prevent the spread of any of the communicable diseases from such state or possession to any other state or possession, he or she may take such measures to prevent such spread of the diseases as he or she deems reasonably necessary. We know that the CDC has authority to issue a nationwide isolation or stay-at-home order or quarantine order, and indeed the regulations beyond what I read to you specifically reference the CDC's authority to do that. The more interesting and harder question is, does the president also have that power because the CDC has that power? Remember, the president supervises the CDC and the rest of the executive branch. So some argue that because Congress delegated that authority to the CDC, and because the president supervises the CDC and the rest of the executive branch, that the president indeed also has that authority, that the president could kind of override a contrary decision of the CDC and order a nationwide stay-at-home or isolation order if the CDC declined to do that. On the other hand, others argue that because Congress specifically delegated that authority to the CDC and the CDC alone, that the president lacks the authority to come in and second guess the CDC and issue a nationwide isolation or stay-at-home order when the CDC has declined to do so. So, at the end of the day, we don't know whether the president could exercise the authority that Congress has delegated to the CDC to issue a nationwide isolation or stay-at-home order if the CDC declined. But under the circumstances, you can bet that the White House and the CDC would figure out a way to work together and make it happen so that it comports with the law. Now, there is another way that the president might be able to do this. Remember, I said earlier in the clip that whenever the president acts, the president has to have a source of authority for that action. Well, as it turns out, Congress over time has delegated vast authority to the president to take actions under emergencies or crises. It might turn out that the president has some kind of congressionally delegated emergency authority to issue a nationwide isolation or quarantine order. If the president has that kind of authority, or if the president could make a reasonable argument that some delegated emergency authority permits him to do this, then the president would have authority to do it. I hope this has been useful. Thanks again for joining me, and again, please everybody stay safe. Thank you.